This week, we look into the spice sack, not for the flavors it held, but for the corporate machine it birthed. Before the shipping container, before the stock market, and before the modern conglomerate, there was the quest for the peppercorn. It was a search that mapped the globe, emptied national treasuries, and created a company that, at its height, was worth more than the top 20 tech giants of the modern world combined. Find a comfortable position, and let us trace the thread of the first corporate empire. To understand the birth of the first corporate empire, one must first understand the illogical, almost hallucinatory value of a single dried berry. In the modern world, a peppercorn is a commodity so common that it is given away for free in paper sachets at fast food restaurants. It is background noise in the kitchen. But in the year 1400, if you walked through the muddy, narrow streets of London or Paris carrying a small pouch of black pepper, you were not carrying a seasoning. You were carrying a fortune. You were carrying the equivalent of a briefcase full of high-denomination banknotes, or a bar of solid bullion. The wealth history of pepper is a study in extreme scarcity and social signaling. In the medieval period, the monetary value of pepper was so stable and so high that it was frequently used as a literal currency. In many European cities, it was known as black gold. Landlords would often accept pepper as a form of rent, leading to the legal term peppercorn rent, which survives today, though its meaning has inverted from a high-value payment to a nominal or symbolic fee. In the 15th century, however, a pound of pepper was often worth the equivalent of 2 or 3 weeks' labor for a skilled craftsman. To put this into a modern perspective, if a skilled modern electrician earns $60,000 a year, a single pound of pepper would have a market value of roughly $3,000 to $4,000. Why was a berry so expensive? The answer lies in the hidden thread of the supply chain. Before the 16th century, pepper traveled an agonizingly slow and dangerous route from the Malabar coast of India. It was moved by small boats to the Persian Gulf, then by camel caravans across the vast, bandit-ridden deserts of Arabia, then sold to Egyptian merchants, then finally bought by Venetian traders who shipped it across the Mediterranean. By the time that pepper reached a table in Germany or England, it had been taxed, traded, and marked up by at least a dozen different middlemen. Each hand it passed through added a layer of cost and a layer of risk. The sheer price of spice created a specific kind of aristocratic wealth. In the courts of the Dukes of Burgundy or the Kings of France, spice was used not just to mask the taste of curing meat, but as a flamboyant display of liquid assets. To serve a dish heavily seasoned with pepper and ginger was to tell your guests that you were wealthy enough to consume the labor of thousands of men and the risk of thousands of miles. It was the ultimate flex of the pre-industrial world. At state banquets, it was common to see spice platters placed in the center of the table, not to be eaten, but to be admired as a collection of precious minerals. The monetary stakes were so high that they influenced international diplomacy. When Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome in 408 AD, his ransom demands were not just for gold and silver, he demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper. He knew that pepper was easier to liquidate and trade across borders than even the coinage of a crumbling empire. By the late Middle Ages, the total European pepper market was estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of modern dollars, yet it was controlled by a tiny bottleneck, the city of Venice. Venice had used the pepper trade to become the richest city in the world. Their spice fortune funded the marble palaces of the Grand Canal and the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. They operated a strict just-in-time monopoly, keeping supply low and prices high. For the rest of Europe, this was an economic stranglehold. The kings of Portugal and Spain looked at the Venetian ledger and realized that if they could find a way to skip the camels and the middlemen, if they could find a hidden thread across the ocean, they wouldn't just be finding a new route, they would be capturing the largest revenue stream in human history. As you listen, imagine the ledger of a 15th century merchant. A single peppercorn represents more than flavor, it represents a system of global trade that was waiting for a spark. The high price of pepper was the pressure cooker that forced the age of discovery. Men did not sail into the unknown to find new lands, they sailed to find the source of the black gold. They sailed to break the Venetian monopoly and to claim a stake in a market where a single successful voyage could turn a ship's captain into a multimillionaire overnight. The spice sack was about to become the foundation of a new kind of power. It was no longer about how much land a king owned, but how much of the global flow he could control. The peppercorn was the tiny, dried seed of the modern capitalist world, and the thirst for its monetary value was about to redraft the map of the earth. If the peppercorn was the engine of global desire, then Venice was the high-walled fortress that controlled the fuel. To understand the hidden thread of wealth in the 15th century, one must look at the city of Venice not as a romantic destination of gondolas, but as the world's most sophisticated, cold-blooded commercial hub. Venice was a city-state built on salt and silk, but it was stabilized by the spice trade. They were the ultimate middlemen, the gatekeepers of the East, and they protected their monopoly with a level of bureaucratic and military precision that would make a modern multinational corporation envious. The Venetian strategy was built on a unique geopolitical advantage. By the year 1450, the Silk Road was failing due to the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Turks. This turned the spice trade into a maritime and desert relay race. Spices from India were brought to the ports of Alexandria in Egypt or Beirut in the Levant. From there, only one European power had the diplomatic standing, the naval strength, and the deep coffers to buy the entire harvest: the Republic of Venice. They were the only ones allowed to trade in these ports, effectively turning the Mediterranean into a Venetian lake. The monetary value of this monopoly was astronomical. It is estimated that in the mid-15th century, the Venetian spice trade generated a yearly profit equivalent to roughly $500 million to $800 million in today's currency, a staggering sum for a single city of fewer than 150,000 people. This wealth was not just stored in gold, it was built into the very stones of the city. Every marble archway, every gold-leafed ceiling in the Doge's palace, and every war galley in the arsenal was paid for by the spice tax the Venetians levied on the rest of Europe. They bought pepper in Alexandria for perhaps 2 or 3 ducats and sold it in the markets of London or Bruges for 10 or 12. This 400% markup was the hidden thread that kept the rest of Europe in a state of perpetual economic disadvantage. The Venetians didn't just sell spice, they controlled the information about spice. To maintain their high prices, they fostered myths about where the spices came from. Medieval consumers were told that cinnamon was harvested from the nests of giant birds or that pepper was guarded by venomous serpents that had to be burned away, which supposedly gave the peppercorns their black, shriveled appearance. By keeping the source a mystery, Venice ensured that no one else would dare to look for it. They sold the mystery alongside the flavor, and the price of that mystery was paid by every king, bishop, and merchant from the Alps to the Atlantic. Inside the city, the spice trade was regulated by the Savi Ali Ordini, a specialized board of trade that functioned like a modern central bank and regulatory commission combined. They controlled the Mudua, a state-organized convoy system. These were not private ships acting on a whim, they were massive, well-armed galleys owned by the state and leased to the highest-bidding merchants. These convoys departed on strict schedules, ensuring that the European markets were never flooded with too much spice. By artificially limiting supply, Venice kept the price of a pound of nutmeg or ginger high enough to remain a luxury, even as their own warehouses groaned under the weight of the harvest. This economic dominance created a spiritual wealth as much as a material one. The Venetian ducat became the US dollar of the 15th century, the only currency trusted from England to the borders of China because it was backed by the most reliable commodity on earth. If you held Venetian gold, you were holding a share in the spice trade. Imagine the frustration of the northern European powers. Every time a German prince or an English lord bought pepper for his kitchen, he was effectively paying a tribute to Venice. He was funding the very navy that prevented him from entering the Mediterranean. He was strengthening the hidden thread that kept him dependent. However, monopolies carry the seeds of their own destruction. The Venetian wealth was so vast and their prices so high that they eventually made it economically rational for other nations to attempt the impossible. As long as pepper was 10 ducats a pound, the risk of sailing around the entire continent of Africa, a journey of 10,000 miles through uncharted, terrifying waters, actually started to look like a good investment. The Venetians were so comfortable in their marble palaces that they didn't realize the hidden thread was being pulled from the other end. By the late 1400s, the Portuguese were beginning to creep down the coast of West Africa. The Venetians laughed at these efforts, calling them the desperate moves of a poor, peripheral nation. They believed the geography of the world was fixed and that the Indian Ocean was a closed sea. They were wrong. The very magnitude of the Venetian monopoly was the bounty that tempted Vasco da Gama to set sail. The $35 per bushel salt famine of the Civil War we discussed earlier was a localized crisis. The Venetian spice monopoly was a continental one, and it was about to be broken not by a war of armies, but by a war of logistics and geography. Venice owned no spice trees or land in India, only the root. When a new thread was discovered, its fortune evaporated. This shift proved that being a gatekeeper is only profitable until someone builds a new gate. To break a monopoly that has stood for centuries, you do not always need a larger army. Often, you simply need a better machine. In the late 15th century, the hidden thread of wealth shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic not because of a change in politics, but because of a breakthrough in naval architecture. This was the era of the caravel, a small, unassuming ship that became the most disruptive technology of its age. If the Venetian galley was a heavy, dependable truck designed for calm coastal roads, the Portuguese caravel was an all-terrain vehicle designed to survive the chaos of the open ocean. The monetary stakes of this engineering shift were immense. Every mile the Portuguese pushed further south along the African coast represented millions of ducats in potential future revenue. However, the Atlantic was a graveyard for traditional European ships. The standard barca used by medieval sailors was heavy, square-rigged, and incapable of sailing into the wind. This meant that once a ship sailed south past Cape Bojada, the prevailing winds would prevent it from ever returning home. For decades, this geographic barrier acted as a natural firewall for the Venetian and Arab spice monopolies. To bypass the middlemen, the Portuguese had to invent a way to cheat the wind. The caravel was the solution, a hybrid of European hull design and Islamic sail technology. The Portuguese adopted the lateen or triangular sail from the Arab dhows they had encountered in the Mediterranean. This allowed the ship to tack, to sail at an angle against the wind. Imagine the economic implications. Suddenly, the ocean was no longer a one-way street. A ship could now venture thousands of miles into the unknown, confident that it could zigzag its way back to Lisbon. The development of this ship cost the Portuguese crown a fortune in research and development, effectively a 15th-century space program, but the projected ROI was the capture of the global spice market. The cost of building and outfitting a single caravel was roughly 2,000 to 3,000 gold cruzados. In modern terms, adjusting for the purchasing power of the time, this is equivalent to roughly $1.5 million to $2 million per vessel. This was a significant capital outlay for a small, relatively poor nation like Portugal. However, the math of the spice sack made it a rational gamble. A single caravel could carry approximately 50 to 60 tons of cargo. If that cargo was filled with high-grade pepper or cinnamon purchased directly at the source in India, the gross revenue from a single successful return voyage could exceed $15 million. Even after accounting for the high mortality rate of the crew and the loss of ships to storms, the potential profit margins were over 500%. This engineering marvel also changed the wealth of knowledge. To navigate these ships, the Portuguese established a secretive research hub at Sagres, led by Prince Henry the Navigator. They began to treat navigation as a data-driven science. They moved away from dead reckoning and toward celestial navigation using the astrolabe and the quadrant. Each caravel was a floating laboratory, its captain required to keep meticulous logbooks. These logs were so valuable to the national economy that they were classified as state secrets. Leaking a navigational map to a rival power like Venice or Spain was a crime punishable by death. The hidden thread was now written in ink in degrees of latitude. The caravel also introduced a new form of mobile capital. Because these ships were small and required fewer crew members than the massive Venetian galleys, they were cheaper to operate over long distances. They didn't need to hug the coastline and pay protection money or harbor fees to local lords along the way. They were independent entities that could stay at sea for months at a time. This autonomy broke the power of the land-based tax collectors. The wealth of the world was moving off the land and onto the water, where it could not be easily seized or taxed by the traditional empires of the East. Imagine the shipyards of Lisbon. They were the Silicon Valley of 1480, buzzing with the sounds of saws and hammers as they built the tools that would devalue the palaces of Venice. The caravel was the first true globalizing technology. It was built for speed, for endurance, and for the cold-blooded pursuit of profit. It was not a comfortable ship. The sailors slept on deck and lived on a diet of salted beef and hardtack, but it was a ship that could reach the source. By the time Vasco da Gama prepared his fleet, the caravel had evolved into the larger nau or carrack, capable of carrying even more black gold. But it was the nimble caravel that had done the hard work of finding the path. The discovery of the sea route to India was not a lucky accident. It was the inevitable result of a massive, state-funded investment in maritime technology. The Portuguese had realized that if you want to control the world's wealth, you don't fight for the old gate, you build a ship that can sail past it. The age of the caravel proved that in the history of wealth, innovation is the ultimate monopoly breaker. The hidden thread was no longer a desert path, it was a wake in the water, trailing behind a small wooden ship that was carrying the future of the global economy in its hold. With the machine perfected, the stage was set for the gamble that would change the ledger of the world forever, the direct voyage to the Malabar coast. In the summer of 1497, the hidden thread of wealth was pulled taut by a man named Vasco da Gama. If the caravel was the machine, and the Sagres research was the map, then da Gama was the venture capitalist of the high seas, a man tasked with executing a high-risk, high-reward strategy that would either bankrupt the Portuguese crown or make it the wealthiest power on earth. This was not a voyage of discovery in the romantic sense, it was a hostile takeover of a global trade route. Da Gama didn't sail with the hope of seeing new lands, he sailed with a ledger in his mind and cannons on his deck. The financial scale of this gamble was unprecedented. King Manuel I of Portugal invested approximately 40,000 cruzados into this specific expedition, a sum that, in modern purchasing power, would exceed $30 million. This covered the construction of 4 specialized ships, the wages for 170 men, and a cargo of trade goods that, ironically, would prove to be nearly worthless in the sophisticated markets of the East. The Portuguese were cash-poor but vision-rich. They were betting that the direct access to the Malabar coast would allow them to bypass the 400% markup imposed by the Venetians and the Mamluks of Egypt. To achieve this, da Gama performed a navigational feat that remains one of the most daring in maritime history. Instead of hugging the African coast, he swung far out into the South Atlantic, almost reaching the coast of Brazil, to catch the westerlies, the powerful winds that would slingshot him around the Cape of Good Hope. For 3 months, his crew saw nothing but empty water. This great swing was a massive risk. If the math of the Portuguese cartographers had been off by even a few degrees, the fleet would have been lost in the doldrums, and the investment would have vanished into the sea. When da Gama finally reached Calicut, India, in May 1498, the economic reality hit him like a physical blow. He arrived at the center of a global trade hub that was far more sophisticated than Lisbon. The local ruler, the Zamorin of Calicut, was used to dealing with wealthy Arab and Chinese merchants who brought fine silks, porcelain, and gold. Da Gama's trade goods, coarse cloth, tin, and honey, were laughed at. From a monetary value perspective, the mission was initially a diplomatic disaster. The Portuguese were seen as pirates rather than partners. However, da Gama understood a different kind of value, the price of a cargo at the source versus the price of a cargo at the destination. Despite the hostility and the meager trade, he managed to acquire a small amount of pepper and cinnamon. When he returned to Lisbon in 1499, having lost 2 of his 4 ships and more than half of his men to scurvy and exhaustion, the true magnitude of the gamble was revealed. The small amount of spice he brought back, just enough to fill a few chests, was sold for 60 times the total cost of the entire 3-year expedition. Let that number sink in as you listen to the steady hum of the narrative. A 6,000% return on investment. This was the moment the hidden thread turned into a golden rope. The Portuguese realized that they didn't need to be better merchants than the Arabs or the Venetians, they just had to be the only ones with a direct pipe to the source. The success of da Gama's voyage devalued the Venetian monopoly overnight. When news of his return reached the Rialto in Venice, the price of bank shares plummeted, and the city's elite realized that their thousand-year reign as the middlemen of the world was over. The gamble also introduced the concept of armed trade. Da Gama realized that because his goods were inferior, he would have to use force to maintain his position. On his second voyage, he returned with a fleet of 20 heavily armed ships. He didn't come to negotiate, he came to impose a cartas system, a mandatory trade license that every ship in the Indian Ocean had to buy from the Portuguese, or face being sunk. This was the birth of protectionism on a global scale. The Portuguese weren't just selling spices, they were taxing the ocean itself. Consider the sheer cold logic of this wealth transition. The Portuguese had discovered that in a global economy, the most valuable asset isn't the product itself, it's the exclusive control of the infrastructure used to move it. By finding the sea route, they hadn't just found a path to pepper, they had found a way to short the entire Mediterranean economy. Da Gama's voyage proved that a small, determined nation could leapfrog over established empires if they were willing to master the hidden thread of logistics. This victory, however, came with a heavy moral debt. The wealth that began to flow into Lisbon was stained by the brutal violence da Gama used to secure the ports. But in the cold ledgers of 15th-century Europe, that debt was overlooked in favor of the sparkling profits. Portugal had become the first global maritime empire, and for a brief, shining moment, the spice sack belonged to them alone. But as they would soon find out, when you discover a thread that leads to a fortune, you shouldn't be surprised when other, more powerful players start trying to pull it out of your hands. The Portuguese breakthrough had set the world on fire. The gamble had paid off, and the era of the spice kings had begun. But far to the north, in the foggy docks of Amsterdam and London, a new kind of entity was watching, an entity that wouldn't just send ships, but would create a whole new way of organizing human greed, the joint stock company. If pepper was the black gold of the world, then nutmeg and mace were its rarest diamonds. To understand the extreme hidden thread of wealth in this era, we must look at a tiny speck on the map of the East Indies, the Banda Islands. For most of human history, these 10 volcanic islands, totaling barely 20 square miles of land, were the only place on the entire planet where nutmeg grew. This biological exclusivity created one of the most concentrated sources of wealth ever known to man. In the markets of the 16th century, a sack of nutmeg bought for pennies in Banda could be sold in London for a life-changing fortune. The monetary value of nutmeg was driven by more than just flavor. During the Elizabethan era, a terrifying rumor took hold in Europe, that nutmeg was the only cure for the Black Death or bubonic plague. Whether it was true or not mattered little to the ledger, the perceived utility caused prices to skyrocket. At its peak, the price of nutmeg in Europe was marked up by a staggering 60,000% over its original cost at the source. To put this in perspective, if you were a sailor who managed to smuggle just a handful of nutmegs in your pocket back to England, you would have enough wealth to buy a small house and retire for life. A single pound of nutmeg was often worth the equivalent of 7 or 8 fattened oxen. The botanical reality of the Banda Islands was a natural monopoly. The nutmeg tree, Myristica fragrans, is a finicky plant. It requires the rich, volcanic soil and the specific, humid weeping climate of the Banda Sea to thrive. The fruit of the tree is a peach-like husk that splits open to reveal a dark seed, the nutmeg, wrapped in a lacy, bright red membrane known as mace. This meant that the Bandanese people held the keys to the kingdom. For centuries, they had traded peacefully with Chinese, Arab, and Malay merchants, maintaining a sophisticated, independent society funded by the steady global flow of their unique crop. However, the arrival of the Europeans changed the value of sovereignty. When the Portuguese, and later the Dutch, realized that the world's entire supply of nutmeg was concentrated on a few tiny islands, the hidden thread turned from trade to conquest. They didn't want to buy nutmeg, they wanted to own the trees. The Portuguese were the first to arrive in 1512, but they found the islands difficult to fortify. The Bandanese were skilled traders and fierce defenders of their autonomy. The islands became a high-value target in a global chess game, where the prize was not territory, but a total cornering of the market. The cost of attempting to control Banda was measured in more than just gold, it was measured in logistical blood. To maintain a presence in such a remote location, thousands of miles from the nearest European base, required a staggering investment in naval power and fort building. The Portuguese built the Fortaleza de Nossa Senhora de Anunciação, but the overhead was immense. The hidden thread of wealth here was fraying. The cost of the military occupation was eating into the profits of the spice itself. This is a recurring theme in the history of wealth. The more concentrated the asset, the more expensive it is to guard. Imagine the scene in the late 1500s. The Banda Islands were a tropical paradise transformed into a high-security vault. The air smelled perpetually of spice, a scent that, to a European sailor, smelled like pure money. But the local Bandanese realized that their natural wealth had become a curse. They were caught in the middle of a resource trap. Because their product was so valuable, the great powers of the world would never leave them in peace. The spice sack had become a weight that was pulling them into a century of conflict. The monetary stakes of the Banda Islands eventually led to one of the most famous real estate trades in history. Because the British and the Dutch both claimed these islands, they eventually reached a stalemate. In the Treaty of Breda in 1667, the British agreed to give up their claim to one of the tiny Nutmeg Islands, the island of Run, in exchange for a seemingly less valuable Dutch territory in North America. That territory was a small fur trading outpost called New Amsterdam. The British renamed it New York. In 1667, the hidden thread of value favored the nutmeg. The world's financiers believed that a tiny island of spice trees was worth more than the entire island of Manhattan. This valuation highlights the distortion of scarcity. In the 17th century, the global economy was still driven by luxury commodities rather than land or labor. The Spice Islands were the Silicon Valley of their time, a tiny geographic area that produced a technology, the nutmeg cure, that everyone believed they needed to survive. The wealth flowing out of Banda was the seed capital for the Dutch Golden Age. It funded the paintings of Rembrandt and the canals of Amsterdam. The very thing that made Banda wealthy was the thing that would eventually lead to its destruction. The quest for the nutmeg monopoly would soon trigger the most brutal corporate takeover in history. The spice sack was about to be seized by a new kind of predator, one that didn't serve a king, but served a board of directors. The age of the individual explorer was ending. The age of the VOC, the first corporate empire, was about to begin. By the year 1602, the hidden thread of wealth had become too large and too dangerous for any single merchant or even a single monarch to manage. The Portuguese had the root, but they lacked the capital to maintain it. The English were beginning to sniff around the edges of the trade, but they were disorganized. It was the Dutch, a small, seafaring nation currently fighting a bloody war of independence against Spain, who came up with a revolutionary solution. They realized that if they wanted to dominate the spice sack, they couldn't just build better ships, they had to build a better way to organize human greed. This was the birth of the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, or the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The monetary innovation of the VOC cannot be overstated. It was the world's first truly public joint stock company. Before this moment, if you wanted to send a ship to the East Indies, you formed a partnership for that specific voyage. When the ship returned, the partnership was dissolved, and the profits were split. But the VOC was designed to be permanent. It was a perpetual corporation. For the first time in history, an ordinary citizen, a baker in Amsterdam, a maid in The Hague, or a wealthy merchant in Rotterdam, could walk into the company's offices and buy a share in the spice trade. They weren't just betting on one ship, they were betting on the entire hidden thread of the Dutch Empire. The capital raised during the VOC's initial public offering was staggering. They collected 6.4 million guilders. To put this into a modern context, if we adjust for the size of the Dutch economy at the time and the purchasing power of gold, this was the equivalent of raising billions of dollars in a single afternoon. It was the largest concentration of private capital the world had ever seen. This war chest allowed the Dutch to do something the Portuguese could never do. They could play the long game. They could afford to lose 3 ships in a row and still have enough money to send 10 more. They had invented a way to diversify risk across thousands of investors, turning the spice sack into a national project. But the VOC was more than just a business, it was a state within a state. The Dutch government, known as the States General, granted the company a 21-year monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. More importantly, they gave the VOC the legal right to build forts, to maintain its own private army and navy, to coin its own money, and, crucially, to wage war and sign treaties in the name of the Republic. The hidden threat had become a sovereign power. The VOC didn't have to wait for orders from a king in a distant palace. Its board of directors, known as the Heeren 17 or the 17 Gentlemen, held more power over the Indian Ocean than any monarch in Europe. The cost of this corporate sovereignty was etched into the company's ledger. The VOC operated with a level of cold, mathematical efficiency that was terrifying to its rivals. They realized that the monetary value of spice was dependent on total control. If they allowed even a small amount of free trade, the prices would drop. Therefore, the VOC's primary expense wasn't the purchase of spices, but the protection of the monopoly. They spent nearly half of their astronomical revenue on their private military. They built massive Indiaman ships, gigantic, floating fortresses armed with up to 40 cannons, specifically designed to intimidate the Portuguese and sink any interlopers who tried to trade in their waters. For the listener drifting into the details of this corporate machine, consider the stock market it created. Because these shares could be bought and sold at any time, a secondary market emerged at the Amsterdam Bourse. This was the birth of modern finance. People began to speculate on the arrival of the spice fleets. If a rumor reached the docks that a ship had been lost to a hurricane, the hidden thread of wealth would vibrate, and share prices would tumble. If news arrived that a new nutmeg grove had been seized, prices soared. The VOC had turned the physical reality of the spice trade into a liquid asset, a piece of paper that represented a claim on the future. This transition changed the very nature of wealth. It was no longer tied to the land you owned or the title you held, it was tied to your portfolio. The VOC was the first company to pay a regular dividend, which averaged an incredible 18% per year for nearly 2 centuries. This consistent flow of fortune created the Dutch Golden Age. It built the canal houses of Amsterdam and funded the greatest scientific and artistic minds of the 17th century. The spice sack was no longer just a bag of seeds, it was the foundation of the modern global economy. The 17 Gentlemen in Amsterdam prioritized the bottom line over souls or kings. The VOC proved corporations, backed by capital and force, could surpass nations and rewrite global laws. This corporate empire brought unprecedented wealth and brutality. The birth of the VOC was the moment the spice sack became the global ledger. The company's logo, the famous VOC monogram, became the most recognized brand on earth, stamped onto every crate of pepper and every cannon that guarded the monopoly. But as the Dutch were about to learn, maintaining a corporate empire of this scale required more than just money, it required a ruthless control over the source itself. The hidden thread of wealth was not merely a calculation of profit and loss, it was a calculation of survival. In the 17th century, to invest in the VOC was to bet against the ocean itself. While the ledgers in Amsterdam promised an 18% dividend, the physical reality was far grimmer. It is a staggering historical statistic that during the peak of the spice trade, approximately 1 in 3 ships that left Europe never returned. This was the cost of doing business in the first corporate empire. The sea was a relentless auditor, and it frequently demanded payment in wood, gold, and human life. The monetary stakes of a single shipwreck were enough to destabilize a minor city. A fully laden Dutch Indiaman was the most expensive object of its time. The hull alone cost roughly 100,000 guilders to construct, and the cargo of silver bullion sent out to buy spices, or the spices brought back, could be worth over 500,000 guilders. In modern terms, losing a single ship was equivalent to a corporation losing a $200 million asset in a single afternoon. Because the VOC was a perpetual corporation with deep pockets, they could absorb these shocks, but the frequency of loss forced them to invent the most sophisticated risk management systems in human history. The risks were multifaceted, forming a hidden thread of danger that began the moment the anchors were raised. First was the structural risk. Despite being the pinnacle of engineering, these ships were made of organic material, oak and pine, that was constantly being eaten by the shipworm. These small mollusks could honeycomb a hull in months, turning a sturdy vessel into a sieve. The VOC spent millions on sacrificial sheathing, double layers of wood with hair and tar in between, just to keep the ships afloat long enough to reach the East Indies. This was the birth of industrial maintenance as a line item on a corporate balance sheet. Then there was the meteorological risk. The route to the Spice Islands required crossing the Roaring Forties, a stretch of the Southern Ocean where the winds are constant and violent. Without modern weather tracking, a captain was sailing blind into potential hurricanes. If a ship was caught in a storm, the hidden thread of wealth was often literally thrown overboard. To lighten the ship and prevent capsizing, the first thing dumped was the heavy cargo. Millions of dollars in copper, iron, and stone ballast, and sometimes even the spices themselves, lie at the bottom of the ocean today, a silent testament to the price of the monopoly. The human risk was perhaps the most expensive and the most tragic. The VOC was a massive employer, but it was a meat grinder for labor. Of the roughly 1 million people the VOC sent to Asia over 2 centuries, only about 1/3 ever returned to the Netherlands. Scurvy, dysentery, and ship's fever, typhus, were the primary accountants of death. A ship might leave Texel with a crew of 300 and arrive in Batavia with only 150 men capable of standing. This high mortality rate created a permanent labor crisis. The VOC had to constantly recruit from the poorest populations of Europe, German mercenaries, displaced peasants, and the desperate, offering signing bonuses that were often just a way to trap men into a debt they could never pay off. This constant threat of loss led to the development of the modern insurance industry. While the VOC was large enough to self-insure, smaller traders and the English East India Company relied on underwriters. In the coffee houses of London and the taverns of Amsterdam, wealthy individuals would sign their names under a list of ship details, agreeing to cover a portion of the loss in exchange for a premium. This was the hidden thread of the financial safety net. If the ship returned, the underwriter kept the premium. If it sank, they paid out. This turned risk into a tradable commodity. The spice trade didn't just bring pepper to Europe, it brought the mathematical certainty of insurance. Consider the logistics of silence. Once a ship dipped below the horizon, the owners would hear nothing for 2 years. There were no radios, no cables, and no updates. A scheduled arrival was a guess at best. This silence created a specific kind of psychological tension in the markets. Speculators would hang around the port lookouts, desperate for the first sight of a VOC flag. The difference between a successful return and a total loss was the difference between a family becoming aristocrats or becoming paupers. The wealth of the Golden Age was built on the back of this terrifying uncertainty. The risk of the sea also dictated the price of the sack. Part of the reason spices remained so expensive for so long was not just the rarity of the plants, but the risk premium added to every ounce. Consumers weren't just paying for the flavor of nutmeg, they were paying for the 3 ships that sank so that the 4th could arrive. They were paying for the shipworm, the scurvy, and the hurricanes. As the narrative continues, remember that every piece of silver or gold you see in a museum from this era was won from the ocean. The VOC's ledger was a record of a war against nature, a war they were winning, but at a cost that is difficult to fathom. The hidden thread was a lifeline, but it was one that was frequently snapped by the sheer scale of the world. But for those who survived, the reward was a city at the center of the world, Batavia. The hidden thread of wealth in the 17th century was not just pulled by merchants, it was enforced by a private government. To understand the VOC, one must look past the ledgers and see the muskets and the forts. In Europe, the VOC was a company of investors, but in Asia, it was a sovereign state. This was corporate sovereignty, a legal and political anomaly that allowed a board of directors in Amsterdam to act as kings, judges, and executioners across the Indian Ocean. The VOC did not just enter markets, it created them through the exercise of absolute power. The monetary value of this sovereignty was found in the right to wage war. The Dutch government granted the VOC the authority to build a private military that eventually dwarfed the national navies of many European kingdoms. At its height, the VOC commanded a private army of 10,000 soldiers and a navy of 40 warships. The cost of maintaining this force was astronomical, consuming nearly 40% of the company's total revenue, but it was viewed as a necessary capital expenditure to protect the spice sack. In the eyes of the 17 gentlemen, a cannon was as much a business tool as a scale or a ledger. One of the most profound expressions of this sovereignty was the power to coin money. The VOC minted its own currency, known as the dout. These copper and silver coins were stamped with the company's monogram, creating a closed economic loop. By paying its employees and local traders in company-issued currency, the VOC ensured that the wealth it generated stayed within its own system. This was the birth of the company town on a global scale. The VOC had realized that if you control the money used to buy the spice, you control the hidden thread of value from both ends. The legal framework of corporate sovereignty also allowed the VOC to bypass the traditional laws of nations. They operated under their own legal code, the Statutes of Batavia. This meant that a Dutch officer could seize a rival Portuguese ship or a local trading vessel, declare it a prize, and keep the profits with no fear of legal recourse in European courts. For the background listener, consider the immense competitive advantage this provided. The VOC didn't have to compete on price, they could simply use their sovereign power to outlaw the competition. They were the judge, the jury, and the largest buyer in the market. However, this power came with a sovereign debt. To maintain control over a territory as vast as the East Indies, the VOC had to build an expensive network of infrastructure. They constructed over 25 major stone fortresses and hundreds of smaller outposts, stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to the shores of Japan. The maintenance of these forts, the logistics of power, was a permanent drain on the company's liquidity. Every brick shipped from the Netherlands to Indonesia, used as ballast in the Indiaman, was an investment in the hidden thread. They were literally building a corporate empire out of the earth. The most controversial aspect of this sovereignty was the right to treaty. The VOC signed hundreds of contracts with local sultans and kings. These were rarely fair trade agreements. Often, they were extorted monopolies. A local ruler would be offered protection by the Dutch Navy in exchange for a contract of exclusive delivery. This meant the Sultan was legally forbidden from selling his pepper or cloves to anyone but the VOC, and always at a price fixed by the company. If the Sultan broke the treaty, the VOC used its sovereign right to declare war, depose the ruler, and install a more compliant partner. The hidden thread here is the total erasure of the line between business and state. The VOC was the first entity to prove that capital, when concentrated enough, can purchase the attributes of a nation. They didn't need to pay taxes to a king, they were the king. They didn't need to lobby for laws, they wrote them. This level of power created a corporate culture that was ruthlessly focused on the preservation of the monopoly. To a VOC governor, there was no moral difference between a stolen peppercorn and high treason. This sovereignty also created a bureaucratic wealth. Because the VOC was a government, it required a massive civil service. Thousands of clerks, accountants, and bookkeepers managed the flow of information across the ocean. This was the birth of modern management. The VOC was the first to use double-entry bookkeeping on a global scale, tracking every penny spent on a musket in Batavia and every guilder earned from a sack of nutmeg in Amsterdam. The hidden thread was now a paper trail, and that trail led back to a single goal, the maximization of shareholder value through the exercise of raw power. As the narrative moves toward the headquarters of this corporate state, consider the precedent it set. The VOC proved that a corporation could be more efficient than a kingdom because it was not distracted by the glory of a crown, it was only interested in the yield of the spice. The era of corporate sovereignty had turned the Indian Ocean into a private boardroom, where the spice sack was the ultimate authority. But even a sovereign company eventually finds that the cost of playing God is a weight that even the deepest ledger cannot carry forever. If the VOC was a corporate empire, then Batavia was its steel and stone hard drive. To maintain the hidden thread of wealth across the vast distances of the Indian Ocean, the company needed a central nervous system, a place where the ledgers could be reconciled and the spice ships could be refitted. In 1619, the Dutch seized the port of Jakarta in Java, burned it to the ground, and built in its place a city that shouldn't have existed, Batavia. It was a fragment of Amsterdam transplanted into the tropical heat, a city designed with the cold, geometric logic of a warehouse. The monetary cost of building Batavia was a massive entry in the VOC's long-term capital expenditure. The Dutch didn't just build houses, they built an entire urban infrastructure in a swamp. They dug miles of canals, built massive stone warehouses known as Groot Boom, and constructed the castle of Batavia, a colossal fortress that served as the company's regional headquarters. The engineering alone cost millions of guilders, but it was an investment in operational efficiency. By centralizing all spice trade in one port, the VOC could audit every single bag of pepper that left the East Indies. Batavia was not built for people, it was built for the spice sack. The architecture of the city reflected the corporate hierarchy of the VOC. The hidden thread of social status was visible in the very streets. The wealthy company officials, known as senior merchants, lived in grand houses along the Tiger Canal. These houses were built in the Dutch style, with narrow fronts and deep interiors, but they were adapted for the tropics with high ceilings and large windows. However, the Dutch obsession with home led to a fatal architectural mistake. They insisted on building stagnant canals and closed-in houses in a climate where such things bred malaria and cholera. The architecture of wealth was also an architecture of death. The city became known as the graveyard of the East, where the mortality rate for Europeans was as high as 50% within the first year of arrival. Despite the human cost, the economic density of Batavia was unparalleled. The city functioned as a global clearinghouse. In its harbor, you would see the hidden thread connecting to every corner of the world. Ships arrived from Japan carrying silver and copper, ships from India arrived with fine textiles, and ships from the Spice Islands arrived with the Holy Grail, nutmeg and cloves. Everything was brought to the VOC warehouses in Batavia, where it was inventoried, taxed, and then resorted for the long voyage back to Europe. This hub-and-spoke model allowed the VOC to control the flow of fortune with absolute precision. No other power in history had ever managed to funnel the wealth of an entire ocean through a single city. The monetary value of the goods sitting in Batavia at any given time was often higher than the entire treasury of many European nations. A single warehouse could contain spice inventories worth 2 to 3 million guilders. Because of this, the city was a high-security zone. The hidden thread was guarded by walls, cannons, and a strict system of passports. Every person in the city, from the wealthiest merchant to the lowliest workers, had a corporate value. The population was a multicultural mosaic: Dutch, Chinese, Javanese, and enslaved people from across Asia, all held together by the gravity of the VOC's ledger. The Chinese community, in particular, became the essential middle managers of the city, running the shops and the construction crews that kept the corporate machine humming. For the listener imagining the humid air of the 1600s, consider the sensory wealth of Batavia. The city smelled of rot and stagnant water, but it also smelled of the world's most expensive perfumes. The warehouses were so packed with cloves and cinnamon that the scent was said to carry miles out to sea, guiding the ships into port. This was the aroma of capital. To the VOC, the smell wasn't just spice, it was the smell of 18% dividends. They had successfully turned a fever-ridden swamp into the most profitable square mile on the planet. But the architecture of Batavia also revealed the company's deepest fear: the loss of control. The city was designed as a fortress against both external enemies and internal rebellion. The canals weren't just for transport, they were defensive moats. The hidden thread was a tightrope, and the Dutch knew that if they lost Batavia, they lost the empire. This paranoia led to the 1740 massacre, where the VOC, fearing a Chinese uprising, turned its cannons on its own residents. It was a dark reminder that a city built solely for profit often lacks the soul required for stability. As the narrative moves from the stone walls of Batavia to the dark forests of the Banda Islands, remember that this city was the anchor of the spice trade. It was the place where the sovereign company proved it could master the geography of the East. Batavia was the prototype for the modern global city, a place built by capital for capital, where the hidden thread of trade was more important than the lives of the people who lived there. The corporate headquarters was complete. Now, it was time for the company to use that power to execute the most brutal merger and acquisition in history. In the cold logic of the VOC's ledger, the most expensive thing in the world is a competitor. By 1621, the hidden thread of wealth had led the Dutch to a ruthless conclusion. As long as the Bandanese people remained independent and sold even a single nutmeg to the English or to local Malay traders, the VOC's global monopoly was incomplete. To protect the 18% dividend and the black gold of the East, the company decided to move beyond armed trade and into total annihilation. This was the Nutmeg Massacre, a moment where the spice sack was filled not with seeds, but with the ruins of a civilization. The man who executed this corporate cleanup was Jan Pieterszoon Koen, the Governor-General of the VOC. Koen was a man who viewed the world entirely through the lens of a balance sheet. He famously wrote to the 17 Gentlemen in Amsterdam, "Trade cannot be maintained without war, nor war without trade." To Koen, the Bandanese people were operational inefficiencies. They had signed treaties they didn't fully understand, and when they continued to trade with the English to survive, Koen used it as a legal pretext for a hostile takeover. He arrived in the Banda Islands with a fleet of 13 ships, 1,600 Dutch soldiers, and a contingent of specialized mercenaries known as the Japanese samurai. The monetary value of this campaign was a calculated investment. The VOC spent over 1 million guilders on the military expedition to Banda. It was an enormous sum, but the projected revenue made it justifiable. If the Dutch could eliminate the local population and take direct ownership of the land, they would control 100% of the world's nutmeg and mace supply. This would allow them to raise prices globally without any fear of being undercut. The massacre was, in the most literal and horrific sense, a monopoly acquisition strategy. The execution was systematic and brutal. Of the estimated 15,000 people who lived on the Banda Islands, fewer than 1,000 survived. Those who weren't killed in the fighting or executed by the mercenaries were driven into the volcanic mountains to starve or were captured and sold into slavery. The hidden thread of the Bandanese culture, which had thrived for thousands of years on the profits of the spice trade, was severed in a matter of weeks. The VOC didn't just take the spice, they cleared the labor and the land to make room for a more controllable system. After the massacre, the VOC faced a new managerial problem. There was no one left to harvest the nutmeg. To solve this, they created the Perkeneer system. They divided the islands into small plantations, and gave them to retired VOC officers and Dutch settlers. To provide the labor, the VOC imported thousands of enslaved people from across the Indian Ocean, East Africa, India, and other parts of Indonesia. This was the birth of the plantation economy in the East. The hidden thread of wealth was now tied directly to the hidden thread of human bondage. The cost of a pound of nutmeg in London now included the price of a human life in Banda. The return on investment for this atrocity was immediate. With the local competition eliminated and the English driven off the islands, the Dutch were able to inflate the price of nutmeg in Europe by nearly 2,000%. For the next century, the VOC held the world in a nutmeg stranglehold. They were so paranoid about losing this monopoly that they mandated that every nutmeg exported from the islands be dipped in lime, a process that sterilized the seed, ensuring that no one could plant a nutmeg tree anywhere else. This was digital rights management, DRM, for the 17th century, a biological lock on a corporate asset. Consider the internalization of cost. To the shareholders in Amsterdam, the Banda massacre was not a crime, it was a success. It was reported in the company's annual reports as a stabilization of the supply chain. The dividends continued to flow, the canal houses grew taller, and the Dutch Golden Age reached its zenith. The hidden thread had become a whip. The wealth of the VOC was now built on a foundation of total control, where the monetary value of a spice was held to be infinitely more important than the sovereign value of a human life. As the narrative moves from the blood-stained soil of Banda back to the boardrooms of the West, remember that the spice sack was never just about flavor. It was about the power to dictate reality. The Nutmeg Massacre proved that a corporation, when given sovereign power, will prioritize the bottom line over any moral or legal restraint. The VOC had become the world's first true supercorporation, and the Banda Islands were its private, high-security farm. But as the Dutch would eventually learn, a wealth built on such a violent hidden thread requires a constant and exhausting effort to maintain, and the ghosts of Banda would haunt the company's ledger until its very end. In the history of wealth, there is no greater example of the distortion of value than the Treaty of Breda in 1667. To the modern ear, the idea of trading the island of Manhattan for a tiny, remote speck of land in the middle of the Indonesian archipelago sounds like a comedic blunder. But in the 17th century, the hidden thread of wealth was pulled by a different set of hands. At that moment in time, the tiny island of Run, part of the Banda Group, was considered one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. This chapter is the story of how a spice monopoly dictated the future of the American skyline. The monetary stakes of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which led to this trade, were centered entirely on the spice sack. The English East India Company had managed to hold onto a single, precarious outpost in the Banda Islands, the island of Run. It was barely 2 miles long and less than a mile wide, but it was covered in nutmeg trees. For the Dutch VOC, Run was a security flaw in their global monopoly. As long as the English held that island, the Dutch could not fully control the world price of nutmeg. The hidden thread was leaking, and the 17 gentlemen were willing to pay almost any price to plug it. The negotiation was a cold-blooded assessment of future cash flow versus strategic control. During the peace talks in Breda, the Dutch held a powerful bargaining chip. They had recently seized the English colony of New Amsterdam in North America, a muddy fur trading outpost on the tip of Manhattan. To the Dutch of 1667, New Amsterdam was a low-margin asset. It was expensive to defend, difficult to manage, and produced mostly beaver pelts, which were subject to the whims of fashion. In contrast, the island of Run was a high-margin asset. It produced a commodity with a 2,000% markup and guaranteed the total closure of the world's most profitable monopoly. The resulting trade was a masterpiece of 17th-century corporate logic. The Dutch agreed to permanently cede New Amsterdam, which the British promptly renamed New York, to the English. In exchange, the English gave up all claims to the island of Run and the wider Banda Islands. At the time, the Dutch were widely considered the winners of the deal. They had successfully completed their vertical integration of the nutmeg trade. They now owned every single tree that could produce the world's most desired spice. Consider the irony. The very city that would become the financial capital of the world was originally traded away as a consolidation prize for a bag of nutmeg. The monetary value of Manhattan in 1667 was estimated at roughly 60 guilders in the famous, though likely apocryphal, purchase from the Lenape people, but its corporate value to the Dutch was essentially zero compared to the spice revenues. The VOC's annual dividends from the nutmeg monopoly after securing Run jumped by nearly 2 million guilders. To the Dutch shareholders, New York was a distraction, Run was the prize. They believed they had traded a wilderness for a money tree. They were looking at the hidden thread of the present, while the English, perhaps accidentally, had grabbed the hidden thread of the future. This trade highlights the fragility of commodity wealth. The Dutch built their fortune on a biological monopoly, something that could be stolen, burned, or devalued by a change in taste. The English, by acquiring New York, had acquired geographic wealth, a deep water port and a gateway to an entire continent. As the 18th century progressed, the value of the nutmeg trade began to plateau as the world found other ways to season its food and treat its diseases. Meanwhile, the value of Manhattan's real estate began an exponential climb that has never truly stopped. Today, the total value of Manhattan's land is estimated at over $1.7 trillion. The island of Run is a quiet, beautiful backwater with almost no commercial significance. The hidden thread here is the illusion of scarcity. The Dutch were so obsessed with controlling a single, scarce resource that they failed to see the value of scale. They chose the spice sack over the New World. This decision effectively marked the beginning of the end of the Dutch Golden Age. They had reached the absolute peak of their monopoly, but they had nowhere left to grow. By closing the door on the Banda Islands, they had inadvertently opened the door for the British Empire to become the next global power. As the narrative leaves the docks of New Amsterdam and returns to the humid forests of the East Indies, consider the legacy of the ledger. Every time you walk down Wall Street or look at the skyscrapers of Manhattan, you are looking at the ghost of a nutmeg. New York exists in its current form because, in 1667, a corporation decided that a tiny island of spice was more important than a continent of land. The hidden thread of wealth is often a story of what-ifs, and the Manhattan trade remains the most expensive real estate transaction in human history, a trade where the price of a spice changed the map of the world forever. The hidden thread of wealth was not just a legal or financial construct, it was a physical battle against chemistry and biology. Once a cargo of nutmeg, pepper, or cloves was secured in Batavia, the greatest challenge began: keeping that wealth alive for the 15,000-mile journey back to Amsterdam. In the 17th century, a spice ship was a giant, floating laboratory of preservation. If the humidity rose too high, or if a single leak developed in the hull, a cargo worth $500,000 guilders could turn into a pile of rotting, worthless compost in a matter of weeks. The logistics of the hold were the invisible guardrails that prevented the Dutch Golden Age from evaporating at sea. The monetary stakes of cargo integrity were absolute. Every cubic inch of a VOC Indiaman was optimized for revenue. To a modern observer, the interior of these ships would look less like a vessel and more like a high-security vault. Spices were not simply thrown into the hold, they were engineered into place. Pepper, because of its durability and weight, was often used as liquid ballast. It would be poured into the very bottom of the ship, filling the gaps between the heavy oak ribs. Above the pepper, more delicate spices like cinnamon and mace were packed in specialized, double-layered chests made of teak or camphor wood, which acted as natural insect repellents. The cost of spoilage was a constant drain on the VOC's potential profits. It is estimated that 10% to 15% of every spice cargo was lost to rot, pests, or seawater damage during the 6-month voyage. In modern terms, this was a hidden tax of roughly $20 million to $30 million per fleet. To combat this, the VOC developed a sophisticated system of dunnage. They used layers of bamboo, rattan, and even dried coconut husks to create air channels within the cargo. This allowed the heat generated by the spices, which can actually undergo self-heating and spontaneous combustion if packed too tightly, to dissipate. The hidden thread here was the air itself. Without it, the ship could literally burn from the inside out. The greatest enemy of the spice sack was the rattus rattus, or the black rat. A single pair of rats could destroy several tons of spice during a voyage, not just by eating it, but by contaminating it. The VOC solution was a biological security budget. Every Indiaman carried a small army of cats, and the company paid a rat bounty to sailors who could produce tails as evidence of a kill. However, the rats were only half the problem. The tropical heat of the Indian Ocean caused the essential oils in the cloves and nutmeg to bleed out of the seeds. If the temperature in the hold stayed above 35 degrees Celsius for too long, the spices would lose their potency, and their market value in Amsterdam would plummet by half. The accounting of the hold was a masterpiece of 17th-century data management. Every chest was stamped with the VOC monogram, a serial number, and the mark of the inspector who had seen it packed in Batavia. This created a chain of custody that was essential for the functioning of the Amsterdam Bourse. When a spice future was traded in Europe, the buyer was betting on the integrity of those seals. The hidden thread was the trust that the physical object in the dark hold of a ship off the coast of Africa matched the description on a piece of paper in a Dutch counting house. If the seals were tampered with, or if the bill of lading didn't match the arrival, the legal penalties were severe, often resulting in the public execution of the ship's quartermaster. Consider the olfactory reality of these ships. A VOC Indiaman did not smell like the sea, it smelled like an explosion in a perfume factory. The scent of thousands of tons of cloves and pepper was so overpowering that it would saturate the wood of the ship itself. Even decades after a ship was retired, its timbers would still give off the faint, spicy aroma of the East. This was permanent wealth, a scent that had been absorbed by the very atoms of the Dutch economy. But for the sailors living on top of this fortune, the smell was a cruel irony. They were surrounded by millions of dollars in luxury, yet they were often starving, surviving on hardtack biscuits that were crawling with weevils. The logistics also included monetary ballast. Because Europe produced very little that the East wanted to buy, the ships sailing out to Batavia were often carrying massive quantities of silver reals and gold bars. This created a balance of payments problem that the VOC solved through the inter-Asian trade. Instead of just sailing back and forth, VOC ships would trade Indian textiles for spices, or Japanese silver for silk, using the profits to buy more spices for the European market. This internal loop allowed the VOC to minimize the amount of precious metal leaving Europe, keeping the hidden thread of Dutch gold secure within the Republic's borders. As the narrative follows the ship into the cooler waters of the North Atlantic, the logistical pressure begins to ease. The spices set in the cooler air, the risk of rot decreases, and the focus shifts from preservation to security. The ship was now a floating target for pirates and rival navies. The spice sack was almost home, but the final thread of the journey was often the most dangerous. The logistics of the hold had successfully brought the wealth across the world. Now, it was time for the bourse to turn that physical cargo into the abstract power of the world's first stock market. When the physical spice sack finally reached the docks of the Texel, it underwent a profound transformation. It ceased to be an agricultural product and became a financial instrument. The heart of this transformation was the Amsterdam Bourse, the world's first purpose-built stock exchange. If the VOC was the body of the first corporate empire, the Bourse was its brain. Here, the hidden thread of wealth was spun into a web of speculation, credit, and derivatives that would define modern capitalism. For the first time in history, the value of a commodity was untethered from its physical presence, allowing men to grow wealthy on the idea of pepper before it had even left the shores of India. The monetary scale of the Amsterdam Bourse was the engine of the Dutch Golden Age. By the 1630s, the daily trading volume on the Bourse often exceeded 2 million guilders, a liquidity that no other city on earth could match. This was not just a place to buy and sell shares of the VOC, it was a laboratory for financial engineering. The Dutch invented short selling, betting that a stock price would fall, options, the right to buy or sell at a future price, and forward contracts. Consider the abstraction of wealth. A merchant in Amsterdam could sell 10,000 pounds of clothes that were currently sitting in a warehouse in Batavia, to a buyer who intended to resell them in London, using money borrowed from a bank in Florence. The hidden thread was now a global ledger of debt and promise. The price of information became the most valuable commodity at the Bourse. Because the VOC's dividends were so high, averaging 18%, even a small rumor could shift the market by millions. This led to the creation of the world's first financial news industry. Courantos, or early newspapers, were published specifically to provide updates on the arrival of the return fleets. Speculators would pay enormous sums to fast couriers who waited at the coast to signal the sighting of a VOC flag. If a ship was reported to be deep in the water, meaning it was heavily laden with spice, the share prices would surge before the ship even dropped anchor. This was the birth of insider trading as a primary driver of wealth accumulation. The Bourse also created the first market bubbles. While the most famous was tulip mania, the spice bubble was more sustained and structurally significant. Because the VOC was a monopoly, its stock was seen as too big to fail. This led to a dangerous level of over-leverage. Dutch citizens would often use their VOC shares as collateral to borrow money to buy more VOC shares. The hidden thread was looping back on itself, creating a mountain of paper wealth that was only as stable as the spice monopoly. The monetary value of the VOC at its absolute peak is estimated to have been $7.9 trillion in modern equivalent, making it, by far, the most valuable company to ever exist, far exceeding the market caps of Apple, Microsoft, or Saudi Aramco. However, the Bourse also introduced the volatility of the sack. Because the spice trade was subject to hurricanes, wars, and rot, the market was prone to sudden, violent crashes. A single report of a pepper glut in London could wipe out 20% of a family's fortune in a morning. To stabilize this, the VOC directors practiced price signaling. They would deliberately burn massive piles of cinnamon or nutmeg in the streets of Amsterdam to show the market that they were willing to destroy supply to keep prices high. This was the physical manifestation of the ledger, a literal smoke signal to investors that the monopoly was still in control. The hidden thread was being protected by fire. The Amsterdam Bourse represents the moment wealth became invisible. In the medieval world, wealth was a pile of gold or a stretch of land. In the Dutch Golden Age, wealth was a line in a book at the Bourse. This abstraction allowed for the massive concentration of capital. By pooling the savings of an entire nation into a single exchange, the Dutch could fund projects that were previously impossible for any king. They could fund the drainage of the seas, the building of massive navies, and the exploration of the globe. The spice sack was the battery that powered the first truly modern financial system. But the Bourse also fostered a culture of greed that was increasingly detached from the reality of the trade. While the brokers in their fine wool coats shouted prices in the courtyard, the packuniers in Banda were overseeing enslaved labor, and sailors were dying of scurvy in the Atlantic. The hidden thread of the Bourse was designed to hide these costs. The ledger only showed the profit, it didn't show the blood or the rot. This financialization of reality is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the spice trade, a system where the movement of a price on a screen, or a chalkboard, is more important than the movement of the physical object it represents. As the narrative leaves the frantic noise of the Bourse and moves toward the quiet rooms where the botanical secrets were kept, consider the fragility of this paper empire. The wealth of Amsterdam was a masterpiece of confidence. As long as everyone believed the spice sack was full and the monopoly was secure, the system worked. But the VOC had a secret. They were no longer the only ones who knew how to grow the black gold. The hidden thread was about to be stolen by a French spy, and the world's most valuable corporation was about to learn that you cannot patent a plant forever. The hidden thread of the Dutch monopoly was tied to a biological secret. For over a century, the VOC's wealth was protected by a simple fact of nature: the spice trees only grew where the Dutch had cannons. To ensure this remained true, the company treated nutmeg seeds and clove plants like top-secret blueprints. Exporting a fertile seed was a capital offense. This was biological protectionism at its most extreme. But in the 18th century, the French Enlightenment brought a new kind of threat: the belief that nature belonged to everyone, or at least, to the French crown. This is the story of Pierre Poivre, a one-armed horticulturalist and spy, who pulled the thread that finally unraveled the VOC's ledger. The monetary value of Poivre's mission was incalculable. At the time, the French were hemorrhaging gold to buy spices from the Dutch. King Louis XV realized that if France could establish its own spice plantations in its colonies, such as Mauritius or Reunion, they could save millions of livres every year and break the Dutch economic stranglehold. Poivre, whose last name literally means pepper, was commissioned to commit the greatest act of corporate espionage in history. He wasn't looking for gold, he was looking for living tissue. He needed seedlings that could survive a journey across the ocean and be successfully transplanted. The espionage operations took place in the 1750s and 60s. Poivre traveled to the edges of the Dutch East Indies, posing as a peaceful merchant or a curious naturalist. He cultivated hidden threads of his own, bribing local officials and even some disillusioned Dutch sailors who were tired of the VOC's brutal regime. The risks were immense. If Poivre had been caught, he would have been executed on the spot, and his mission would have been erased from history. But Poivre understood a fundamental weakness of the VOC. Their monopoly was so vast that it was impossible to guard every inch of the coastline. In 1769 and 1770, he successfully smuggled out several dozen nutmeg and clove seedlings, hidden in the holds of French ships. The cost of this intellectual property theft was the eventual collapse of the Dutch monopoly's price-setting power. Poivre didn't just steal the plants, he broke the biological lock. Once the seedlings reached the French botanical gardens in Mauritius, the secret was out. Within a decade, the French were producing their own cloves and nutmeg. They didn't have the volume of the VOC yet, but the monopoly had become a duopoly. Consider the market reaction. The risk premium that had kept spice prices high for 2 centuries began to evaporate. The Amsterdam Bourse realized that the VOC's money trees were no longer unique. The VOC responded with aggressive erasure. They sent expeditions to burn any unauthorized spice trees they found on independent islands, attempting to scorch earth the very biology of the East Indies. But it was too late. The hidden thread had been duplicated. The monetary value of a VOC share, which had been the gold standard of investment for 150 years, began its first serious decline. The company was forced to lower its prices to compete with the new French supply, which meant their massive overhead, their private army, their fortresses, and their bureaucracy began to eat into the actual profits. The sovereign debt of the VOC was becoming unsustainable. This chapter of wealth history illustrates the inevitability of knowledge leakage. In the long run, no corporation can keep a monopoly on a living thing. Whether it is a spice tree in the 1700s or a proprietary seed in the modern era, the hidden thread eventually finds its way into new hands. Poivre's espionage was the first major short against the Dutch East India Company. He proved that the VOC's power was not based on superior management or better ships, but on a geographic accident that he had successfully corrected. For the listener, imagine the scene in the French royal gardens. A single, small nutmeg tree, growing thousands of miles from the Banda Islands, was a weapon more effective than 100 cannons. It represented the democratization of luxury, though only for the French elite at first. It signaled the end of the era where one company could dictate the flavor of the world. The spice sack was being torn open from the bottom, and the wealth was beginning to spill out. As the narrative moves from the gardens of Mauritius back to the crumbling ledges of Amsterdam, consider the irony of Pierre Poivre's legacy. He is remembered as a hero of science and a patriot of France, but to the VOC, he was the ultimate corporate saboteur. He had stolen the hidden thread that tied the Dutch Golden Age together. The era of the Spice Kings was entering its twilight, and the next century would be defined not by the control of the plant, but by the pepper price war that would follow, a race to the bottom that would eventually lead the world's most valuable company into the abyss of bankruptcy. For 2 centuries, the hidden thread of wealth had been wound tight by the hands of monopolists. But as the 18th century drew to a close, that thread began to snap under the weight of a new economic reality: competition. The successful espionage of the French, the rising aggression of the British East India Company, and the emergence of independent American interlopers created a perfect storm. The world was about to experience the first truly global price war. It was a race to the bottom that would transform pepper from a luxury asset held in royal treasuries into a common household staple, and in doing so, it would destroy the foundation of the Dutch East India Company. The monetary collapse was swift and unforgiving. In the year 1670, the VOC could dictate a price for black pepper that yielded a 400% profit margin. By 1780, that margin had shriveled to less than 30%. Consider the catastrophic impact on the VOC's corporate structure. The company was still carrying the legacy costs of its empire. It still had to pay for the 25 massive stone fortresses, the 10,000 soldiers, and the thousands of bureaucrats in Batavia. When the price of pepper dropped, the VOC's fixed costs stayed the same, but its revenue cratered. The company was effectively a giant machine designed to run on high-margin fuel, and it was now being forced to run on fumes. The new players in the market were leaner and hungrier. American merchants from Salem, Massachusetts, began to sail directly to Sumatra, bypassing the VOC's tax-heavy ports. These Americans didn't have a private army or a sovereign state to support. They were privateers in the truest sense. They would trade silver and manufactured goods directly with local Sumatran chiefs, often at night to avoid Dutch patrols. Because their overhead was virtually zero compared to the VOC, they could sell pepper in Europe and America at prices that the Dutch couldn't even match at the source. The hidden thread was being cut by thousands of small, agile knives. The VOC's response was a desperate attempt at market manipulation. They tried to flood the market themselves to drive the newcomers out of business, but this only accelerated their own bankruptcy. The monetary value of the VOC stock, which had been the bedrock of the Dutch economy for 180 years, began to lose its luster. Investors realized that the spice sack was no longer a guaranteed fortune. The dividends that had averaged 18% were now being paid out of borrowed money, a classic sign of a corporate death spiral. The hidden thread of wealth was now a noose. The pepper price war also changed the social value of spice. As prices fell, the middle classes of Europe and the Americas could finally afford to season their food like aristocrats. Their elite flex of the medieval banquet was gone. Pepper was now sold in general stores in the smallest villages. This democratization of flavor was a victory for the consumer, but it was the end of an era for the financier. The spice sack had lost its mystery, and without mystery, it lost its ability to command an irrational price. The wealth of the world was moving away from controlled commodities and toward industrial production. This period represents the first great deflation. It proved that the hidden thread of a monopoly is only as strong as your ability to keep the world small. Once the ocean became a highway for everyone, the monopoly was doomed. The Dutch, who had spent millions of guilders to build a wall around the East Indies, found that the wall was useless against the simple economic law of supply and demand. The wealth of Amsterdam, once so solid and marble-clad, began to feel like paper. The pepper price war was not just an economic event, it was a shift in global power. As the VOC's profits dried up, the Dutch Republic's ability to defend itself also weakened. The spice fortune had funded the Dutch Navy. Without it, they could not hold off the rising power of the British. The hidden thread of wealth was being respooled in London. The British East India Company, observing the Dutch collapse, realized they didn't need to own every tree, they just needed to own the market. They shifted their focus from spices to textiles and tea, the next great threads in the history of wealth. The Dutch had been so successful at creating a global desire for spice that they had invited the rest of the world to destroy them. They had taught the world that the spice sack was the ultimate prize, and the world had responded by taking it. The price war was the final audit of the first corporate empire, and the result was a negative balance that no amount of bookkeeping could hide. If the Amsterdam Bourse was the mind of the global economy, the Indiaman ship was its exhausted, battered body. To the investors in Europe, the spice sack was an abstract entry in a ledger. But for the 200 to 300 men crammed into a wooden hull for 8 months at a time, wealth was measured in cubic inches of breathing room and the absence of rot. Life aboard a VOC vessel was a grueling exercise in human endurance, where the hidden thread was literal, the hemp ropes that blistered hands and the threadbare hammocks where men spent their few hours of fitful sleep. The monetary cost of labor was the VOC's most ruthless calculation. Sailors were not seen as employees, but as depreciating assets. A common sailor earned roughly 10 to 15 guilders a month, a wage so low that it barely covered the cost of their gear. However, the VOC utilized a debt trap system. Many sailors were recruited from the Zuidvlies districts of port cities, given a signing bonus or an advance on their wages, and then charged exorbitant prices for their food and bedding once at sea. By the time the ship reached Batavia, most sailors owed the company more than they had earned. This was the negative wealth that fueled the Dutch Golden Age. The physical environment was a sensory nightmare. The middle deck, where the men lived and ate, had a ceiling height of barely 5 feet. Here, the hidden thread of wealth was a thick, humid haze of sweat, tobacco smoke, and the stench of the bilge, the stagnant, toxic water that collected at the bottom of the hull. In the tropics, temperatures on this deck could reach 40 degrees Celsius 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The only thing that smelled better than the men was the cargo beneath them. Ironically, sailors often slept directly above millions of dollars in fragrant clothes while their own bodies were covered in the sores of scurvy. Scurvy was the silent accountant of the voyage. Without fresh fruit or vegetables, the hidden thread of biological health began to unravel. Sailors' gums would swell, their old wounds would reopen, and their teeth would fall out. The VOC attempted to solve this with lemon juice, but they didn't yet understand the science of vitamin C, and the juice was often boiled until the nutrients were destroyed. At its worst, a ship could lose 50% of its crew before reaching the Cape of Good Hope. The company simply factored these deaths into their operating expenses. To the board of directors, a dead sailor was simply a saved wage. The social stratification of the ship was a microcosm of the empire itself. At the very top, the captain and the senior merchants lived in relative luxury in the great cabin at the stern, eating fresh meat from livestock kept on deck and drinking fine wine. At the bottom were the soldiers and boys, who survived on a diet of hardtack, biscuits so infested with weevils that they were often eaten in the dark so the men wouldn't see what they were swallowing. This massive wealth gap was maintained by the Articles of War. Any sign of mutiny was met with keel-hauling, dragging a man under the ship's barnacle-encrusted hull, or execution. The stability of the spice sack depended on a culture of absolute terror. For those who survived the outward journey, the reward was not gold, but privileged trade. The VOC allowed its officers to carry a small chest of private cargo. This was the only way a man could truly move up the hidden thread of social class. An officer might use his chest to smuggle high-quality silk or rare porcelain. If he survived the return trip, the profit from that one chest could exceed 10 years of his official salary. This incentive structure was what kept the best maritime minds in the service of the company, despite the horrific risks. It was a gamble where the stakes were your life, and the house, the VOC, almost always won. The ship was also a data collector. Every day, the officers recorded wind speeds, water temperature, and celestial sightings. This information was the intellectual capital of the company. When a sailor died, his belongings were auctioned at the mast, but his logbooks were seized by the company. The VOC realized that the hidden thread of wealth was made of information as much as it was made of spice. The collective experience of 1,000 dead sailors was distilled into the maps and charts that allowed the next fleet to sail slightly faster and slightly safer. The Indiaman was a world of compressed time. Months of boredom were punctuated by minutes of absolute chaos, storms, pirate attacks, or the sight of land. When a ship finally returned to the Netherlands and its spice sack was unloaded, the sailors were often cast off with little to show for their years of service. They had moved the wealth of the world from one hemisphere to another, but they remained at the very bottom of the ledger they helped to build. The Golden Age was a polished facade, and the Indiaman's hold was the dark, damp reality that made the shine possible. In the cold accounting of the VOC, there was a silent, recurring line item that never appeared on the official balance sheet sent to Amsterdam, yet it was the most consistent cost of the spice trade, the scurvy debt. While the spice sack grew heavier with every successful voyage, the human cost was paid in a biological bankruptcy. Scurvy was not just a disease, it was a logistical tax on the hidden thread. It was the price the human body paid for being transported across climate zones without the necessary chemical tools to survive. The monetary implications of scurvy were profound. A ship that lost half its crew to the sea plague was a ship that could not be effectively defended against pirates or navigated through storms. The VOC's human capital was leaking away at an average rate of 10% to 15% per voyage, but on the long stretches between the Cape of Good Hope and Indonesia, that number often spiked. This created a labor scarcity in Batavia, forcing the company to pay higher recruitment bonuses in Europe. By the mid-18th century, the VOC was spending an estimated 500,000 guilders annually just to replace the men who had been consumed by scurvy. This was a debt that could not be refinanced, it had to be paid in flesh. The biological reality of scurvy is a breakdown of the body's structural integrity. Without vitamin C, the body cannot produce collagen, the glue that holds tissues together. The description is visceral. Old scars would literally unzip, teeth would loosen in their sockets, and the connective tissues of the heart would weaken. The hidden thread of the sailor's own life was unraveling at the molecular level. To the VOC, this was a mechanical failure of the labor force. They attempted to treat it with vinegar, sulfuric acid, and even mercury, but none of these addressed the core nutritional deficit. The VOC did, however, invest in biological infrastructure to manage the debt. They established the company's garden at the Cape of Good Hope specifically as a refueling station for human health. This was a multi-million guilder investment in soil and seeds. Every VOC ship was required to stop there to take on fresh citrus, cabbage, and herbs. This green intervention was perhaps the most successful risk management strategy in the company's history. By providing a midway point for biological recapitalization, the VOC managed to keep its ships moving. The garden was a strategic asset that protected the spice sack by keeping the hands that carried it from falling apart. The scurvy debt reveals the disconnection of wealth. The people eating the nutmeg spice puddings in the grand houses of Amsterdam were entirely insulated from the physical decay that made their luxury possible. The hidden thread functioned as a sensory filter. It delivered the aroma of the cloves but filtered out the smell of the ship's hospital. This is a recurring theme in the history of capital. Wealth often aggregates in places where the externalities, the sickness, the labor, and the suffering, are invisible. The debt also led to a strange form of medical innovation. The VOC surgeons were among the first to conduct large-scale, albeit primitive, clinical observations on nutritional health. They noticed that sailors who ate sauerkraut or fresh greens recovered almost instantly. Yet, because of the inertia of the ledger, it took nearly a century for this knowledge to be standardized. The VOC was a conservative machine. It was easier to buy new men than to change the entire logistical system of shipboard food. The scurvy debt remained a permanent feature of the trade until the very end, a reminder that the spice sack was a heavy burden that eventually crushed the very people who bore it. As the century turned, the scurvy debt combined with the pepper price war to make the VOC's business model obsolete. The cost of keeping a human being alive for 8 months at sea was becoming higher than the value of the labor they provided. The hidden thread was no longer profitable. The company had mastered the geography of the world, but it had failed to master the biology of its own workers. The sea plague had been a constant companion of the spice sack, and in the end, the debt was called in. The world's first corporate giant was not just bankrupt in its treasury, it was bankrupt in its soul. By 1799, the hidden thread of wealth was no longer a golden rope, it was a frayed, tangled mess of debt and deceit. The world's first and wealthiest supercorporation didn't collapse because of a single storm or a lost battle. It succumbed to a fatal combination of massive overhead, systemic corruption, and a fundamental inability to adapt to a changing world. To understand the fall of the VOC is to understand the gravity of the ledger, the point at which a system becomes so large and so rigid that it collapses under its own weight. The monetary deficit at the time of the VOC's dissolution was a staggering 119 million guilders. In modern terms, this was a corporate bankruptcy on par with the largest financial collapses in history, exceeding the scale of Enron or Lehman Brothers relative to the global economy. The sovereign debt of the VOC had become its undoing. The company was spending more on its military, its 25 stone fortresses, and its bloated administrative staff in Batavia than it was earning from the spice sack. The 18% dividends that had dazzled investors for nearly 2 centuries were no longer being paid from profits, but from massive loans taken out from the Dutch state and private banks. The VOC had become a Ponzi scheme dressed in a corporate uniform, using tomorrow's debt to pay for yesterday's luxury. Corruption was the rot in the wood that ate the company from within. Because the VOC's official salaries were kept intentionally low to save on labor costs, its offices in the East developed an elaborate, parallel economy of private trade and graft. This was the hidden thread of the employee's own wealth. A governor in Malacca or a clerk in Batavia would underreport the amount of spice harvested, sell the surplus to the English or Americans, and pocket the difference. This practice was so pervasive that the Dutch public began to joke that the VOC's initials actually stood for, perished under corruption. The company was being cannibalized by the very people hired to protect its monopoly. The logistical inertia of the company also played a role in its downfall. The VOC was a victim of its own success. It had built a massive infrastructure designed for a world of high-margin monopolies. When the pepper price war and botanical espionage broke that monopoly, the VOC couldn't downsize. It was stuck with a fixed cost structure that required massive volume to stay profitable. While the British East India Company was pivoting toward more sustainable commodities like tea and textiles, the VOC remained obsessed with the spice sack. They were a 17th-century company trying to survive in an 18th-century market. The geopolitical landscape of the late 1700s provided the final blow. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War devastated the VOC's fleet, and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars saw the Netherlands occupied by French forces. The British took this opportunity to seize many of the VOC's key territories, including the Holy Grail of the Banda Islands. The hidden thread was being forcibly rerouted to London. The Dutch state, itself facing bankruptcy, could no longer bail out the failing corporation. In 1796, the government took over the company's administration, and on December 31, 1799, the VOC was formally dissolved. Consider the psychological shock of this collapse. For 197 years, the VOC had been the most stable, most powerful economic entity on Earth. It was the first too-big-to-fail corporation, and yet, it failed. The monetary value of its shares went to zero, wiping out the savings of thousands of Dutch families who had viewed the VOC as a national piggy bank. The Spice Kings had been dethroned not by a rival army, but by their own balance sheets. The era of the first corporate empire was over, leaving behind a legacy of immense wealth, profound brutality, and a warning that no monopoly lasts forever. The fall of the VOC proved that in the history of wealth, sovereignty and commerce are a dangerous mix. When a company becomes a state, its priorities become blurred. It spends its profits on wars and its time on bureaucracy, eventually losing the agility required to survive in a competitive market. The hidden thread of the spice trade didn't disappear with the VOC, it simply moved into new hands, hands that were less interested in owning the trees and more interested in owning the flow of the trade itself. As the 18th century closed, the sun set on the Dutch Golden Age. The Grand Canal houses of Amsterdam remained, but the engine of fortune that built them was gone. The spice sack was now open to the world, and the secrets of the VOC were laid bare in the final audit. The company was dead, but the financial and logistical systems it had pioneered were just beginning their journey to dominate the modern world. The VOC may have perished in 1799, but its hidden thread was never truly severed. Instead, it was woven into the very fabric of the modern world. We often think of the spice trade as a relic of wooden ships and silk waistcoats, but the systems the Dutch perfected to manage the spice sack are the exact same systems that run the global economy today. From the way you invest in your retirement to the way your smartphone is shipped across the ocean, you are operating within a framework designed by the 17 Gentlemen of Amsterdam. The VOC didn't just move pepper, it invented the machinery of global capital. The most enduring financial legacy is the public stock market and the concept of fractional ownership. Before the VOC, wealth was largely static, tied to land, titles, or physical gold. The Dutch transformed wealth into something liquid and abstract. By allowing ordinary citizens to buy shares, they created the first publicly traded company. This was a revolutionary shift in the monetary value of human ambition. It proved that by pooling the small savings of thousands, you could generate more financial gravity than even the wealthiest king. This joint stock model became the blueprint for the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the railroads, and eventually, the tech giants of Silicon Valley. Every time you see a ticker symbol on a screen, you are looking at a descendant of the VOC's original ledger. Connected to this was the invention of limited liability. This was the hidden thread that encouraged extreme risk-taking. Before the VOC, if a business failed, the partners were personally responsible for the debts, often ending up in debtor's prison. The Dutch legal innovation ensured that a VOC shareholder could only lose the amount they had invested. This protection decoupled personal survival from business failure, creating a psychological safety net that allowed for the great gamble of global trade. Without limited liability, the massive capital outlays required for modern infrastructure, from oil rigs to space exploration, would be deemed too risky for any private entity to undertake. The logistical legacy is equally profound. The VOC created the first truly global supply chain. They were the first to master the hub-and-spoke model of distribution, using Batavia as a central clearinghouse to consolidate goods from Japan, India, and the Spice Islands before sending them to Europe in massive, synchronized return fleets. This was the precursor to the modern containerization system. The VOC also pioneered just-in-time thinking, within the limits of wind and tide, tracking inventory turnover with a precision that would make a modern logistics manager proud. They understood that stored spice was idle capital, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that the flow of fortune was constant. Their accounting of the world also changed forever. The VOC's insistence on double-entry bookkeeping and standardized reporting created a universal language for wealth. They required their clerks in distant outposts to send meticulous records back to Amsterdam, creating a paper trail that allowed the board of directors to audit the empire from thousands of miles away. This was the birth of corporate governance and global management. The Dutch realized that in a world of invisible wealth, the only thing that matters is the integrity of the ledger. This culture of data-driven decisions is the direct ancestor of modern business intelligence and the big data algorithms that track global markets today. Even our insurance markets are part of the scurvy debt legacy. The necessity of managing the risk of the sea led to the development of sophisticated actuarial science. The VOC's ability to self-insure by spreading risk across hundreds of ships and thousands of investors was a masterclass in risk mitigation. Today, the global insurance industry, which underpins everything from home ownership to international shipping, operates on the same mathematical principles of probability and diversification that the Dutch used to calculate the odds of an Indiaman surviving a hurricane off the Cape of Good Hope. Consider the hidden thread in your own pocket. The corporate identity, the idea that a company is a legal person that can own property, sign treaties, and outlive its creators, is perhaps the VOC's most powerful invention. We live in a world where corporations are the dominant players in human history, often holding more wealth and influence than many nation-states. This corporate sovereignty was first tested and proven in the spice-soaked islands of the East Indies. The VOC showed that capital, when organized correctly, has no borders and no masters. As we look at the modern world, it is easy to forget that the spice sack was the catalyst for all of this. The desire for a cheaper peppercorn led to a revolution in how humans interact with money, risk, and each other. The hidden thread has become a global network of fiber optic cables and satellite links, but the core logic remains the same. We are all participating in a giant, ongoing audit of the world's resources. The VOC is gone, but the ledger of the world remains open, and we are still adding lines to the story they began. We end our journey not in the high-stakes courtyard of the Amsterdam Bourse, nor in the humid, blood-soaked groves of the Banda Islands, but in the quiet, domestic space of your own pantry. Today, you can walk into a local grocery store and purchase a jar of black pepper for the price of a modest cup of coffee. You can find ground nutmeg, whole cloves, and sticks of cinnamon in the spice aisle of any supermarket from Seattle to Seoul. This is the ultimate monetary transformation of the spice trade, the complete transition of a sovereign treasure into a common utility. The rarest substances of the ancient world, for which kings bankrupted their treasuries and millions lived and died, have become so mundane that we often forget they are there. The price of a spice today is a testament to the total victory of volume over exclusivity. During the peak of the VOC's monopoly, a pound of nutmeg in London could represent the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled worker. Today, that same pound of nutmeg, produced by a globalized agricultural industry, costs a fraction of a single hour's minimum wage. In modern economic terms, the relative value of these spices has plummeted by more than 99.9% since the 17th century. The hidden thread has been stretched and multiplied until the tension of scarcity snapped entirely. We are living in a world of flavor abundance that would have been unimaginable to the 17 gentlemen of Amsterdam. This democratization of flavor was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of the very systems the VOC pioneered. The logistical infrastructure of the modern world, container ships, automated warehouses, and global satellite tracking, is the final evolution of the Indiaman and the spice sack. Because we can now move millions of tons of cargo with the same effort it once took to move a single chest of cloves, the risk premium has been socialized and minimized. The scurvy debt has been solved by refrigerated transport and synthetic vitamins, and the botanical secrets of the East have been mapped to the genome. The hidden thread of wealth is now so efficient that it has made the once extraordinary completely ordinary. Consider the cultural erasure that comes with this abundance. In the medieval world, the scent of pepper was the scent of power. To serve a spice dish was to demonstrate that you had the reach to touch the other side of the planet. Today, when we sprinkle pepper on an egg or grate nutmeg into a latte, we are performing an act of casual aristocracy. We are consuming the black gold of history without the audit of the soul that once accompanied it. The hidden thread has become so thin and transparent that we no longer feel its weight. We have inherited the empire of the pantry, but we have lost the sense of wonder that once made these seeds more valuable than gold. The legacy of the ledger is also visible in our modern consumer behavior. The VOC was the first entity to prove that human desire could be manufactured and managed on a global scale. They didn't just sell spices, they sold the idea of flavor as a status symbol. Today, our global economy is built on the same manufactured scarcity and brand loyalty. Whether it is the latest smartphone or a designer handbag, we are still following the hidden thread of desire that the Dutch merchants first exploited in the 1600s. The spice sack was the prototype for every consumer trend that has followed. It taught us that the world is a market, and we are all, in some way, shareholders in the trade. As you look at the spices in your kitchen, see them as biological time capsules. That small jar of cloves is a record of 15,000-mile voyages, of sovereign companies that behaved like gods, and of the first global stock market. It is a reminder that wealth is not just about money, but about access. The hidden thread connects your kitchen counter to the volcanic soil of Indonesia, the counting houses of Amsterdam, and the blood-stained forts of the 17th century. You are the beneficiary of the greatest merger and acquisition in human history, the merger of the East and the West into a single, interconnected pantry. The story of the spice sack is the story of how the world became one. It began with a desperate search for a way to preserve meat and mask the taste of rot, and it ended with the creation of the global financial system. The hidden thread was a lifeline, a whip, and a ledger, and it continues to pull us forward into a future of even greater connectivity. The rarest treasures of the ancient world didn't disappear. They simply found a permanent home in the most important room in your house. The trade is finished, the audit is complete, and the flavor of the world is finally, for better or worse, the same for everyone. Thank you for exploring the history of spice with us. If you enjoyed this journey, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and we'll see you next week when we weave into the fortunes of silk.